Hi, it's Brenda with Vintage Texas Crimes, and I'm here today to talk about something that happened in Odessa, Texas, in the oil fields in 1968 through 1971. There was a serial killer in Odessa during those years. He surfaced in 1968 and he killed his last victim in 1971. Yesterday, I noticed a pair of shoes lined up under my desk, and it sparked a memory. About 6 years ago, I came across an article in the Odessa American from June 1971. But yesterday, when I saw the shoes, I couldn't remember what year it was that all this happened. I started trying to search through all the years in the 70s. I just remembered it was a really grim story about a young woman who had gone missing from her job in Odessa. She worked as a dispatcher at an oil field company, and her office was one of those temporary office buildings on an isolated road off the Kermit Highway, right outside of Odessa. Back then, that stretch of road was desolate, from what I could tell from reading the article that I read and seeing a couple of the photos. I got the sense that her office sat in the middle of nowhere, and I've included a photo I found of an Odessa oil field with this video. If you've never seen one in person, it's hard to imagine the desolation one could feel in those places like that, out in those oil fields. It's just, it's like everything looks the same. It was nothing but really a grid of sandy roads and dirt, and the wind blew constantly, leaving everything and everyone that the wind touched coated in grit. The only landmarks were oil well pumps and the scattered temporary buildings. Like it was from that harsh and dusty setting that the young dispatcher vanished, leaving her shoes under her desk, her purse, and her car. And that image stuck with me. The shoes were probably a pair of loafers, easy to slip on and slip off. I could see them in my mind side by side on the floor beneath her desk that day when I read the article about her. And I could, it just burned into my brain. To me, that was just loaded with meaning because a woman does not walk away from her desk and leave her shoes under it, especially not out there. I mean, she left the building, she would have had her shoes on if she could have. So to me, that said there was foul play without even knowing what else happened. I knew I wanted to write about her this week. She was on my mind then. And I couldn't remember the year exactly. I only knew it was the 70s, and I couldn't recall her name. I remembered she was a single mom, hardworking, careful, cautious, and her boss said she was one of the good ones, which had been, and she had been with that company for nearly 4 years. He said she didn't run around with the boys, and when he said that, I took that to mean the roughnecks that she worked with. He spoke of her with genuine respect. Still, I couldn't track her down until I remembered one unusual detail about the case, something about the killer. And a phrase stuck in my mind, branded initials. And I'll explain that in a little bit, but that was the key that I needed. I put branded initials into the Odessa American, and a dozen articles popped up about the topic that I was looking for. And just like that, I found her. Her name was Gloria Sue Nix Green, and she went by Sue Nix. Green was the name of her ex-husband. She was everything I mentioned above, plus kind, attractive, and petite at 5'2" and 110 pounds. A mother, a quiet homebody, careful and conscientious. She was close to her parents, didn't go out much, especially at night. Friends and family said her main concern was for her little boy, Don Michael, who was just 4 years old. So these were the 1968 through 1971, what police and the media called the Odessa Lust killings. I called it evil in the West Texas oil fields because it wasn't just this guy. There was a lot of bad stuff going on then. Most Texans have heard the chilling tales of the Texas killing fields and, those bleak stretches along I-45 between Galveston and Houston where girls and women vanished or turned up dead for years. And if you grew up within 100 miles of Houston, like I did, those stories were practically folklore. So the same thing was going on in Odessa, but we never heard about it. Um, I stumbled across the story while running keyword searches like murder, missing, abducted, and I was looking for the topics that I write about, which usually have something like that in there. To my shock, one 1971 edition of the Odessa American carried not one, but three major crimes on the front page involving girls and women who had either vanished or been murdered. And I remember telling a friend that must have been a terrifying time to live in near the oil fields because they were just clustered up. I mean, it was not like you had a crime and then a crime and then no, it was just like they were just coming all at one time. Now, between 1950 and 1970, Odessa's population exploded from 29,000 to nearly 80,000. That kind of boom often outpaces a town's infrastructure, including its police force. So by 1971, it was clear there weren't enough officers to keep up with the growing problems associated with the oil field. And I'm going to explain that too, especially for women. And then there was the killer. You know, he stalked his victims in and around the oil fields, so he was probably a roughneck. He was bold and unpredictable and mobile. He abducted women in broad daylight or under the cover of night. He raped them and murdered them, and then he dumped their bodies in remote areas where they might not be found for weeks. And he was really good at hiding bodies. According to the sources I'll list at the bottom of this article, law enforcement did not realize they had a serial predator on their hands until 1971. And I just said at the bottom of this article because I'm reading from the Facebook version of it. But if you're on YouTube, it'll be in this notes section. After the disappearance of 25-year-old Gloria Sue Nix Green is when they realized, okay, we have got a problem. And that was only after they had 4 women who had been abducted and 2 which had been found dead. I'm going to go over the victims very quickly. 1968 through 1971. October 19th, 1968, Linda Cugat, 24 years old, a waitress in a bar, vanished from a laundromat. Her half-finished laundry and car were found at the scene. November 5th, 1968, Dorothy Smith, a motel owner, is found shot to death in her Monahan's apartment. Her hands were bound with television cable. July 16th, 1970, Eula K. Miller was discovered nude and stabbed multiple times in her Odessa apartment. September 16th, 1970, Nancy Mitchell was abducted from her home while her children slept in the next room. January 9th, 1971, Ruth Maynard. January 9th, 1971, Ruth Maynard, wife of an Odessa police officer, disappeared after being seen at a North Odessa night spot. She was sitting alone, waiting to meet another woman for a night out, and they only saw her sitting there by herself, and then she was gone. And nobody saw her leave with anyone. She just disappeared. June 17th, 1971, Gloria Sue Green, as you know, disappeared from her job on the Kermit Highway. Her locked car was found near the office, her purse and keys inside, her shoes still under her desk. The company payroll had been left on her desk, and it was also missing. August 1971, now we're moving into something a little different. There was a little girl missing in that August. On August 23rd, 1971, Johnny Janelle Henderson, age 11, went missing from her home in the early morning hours. Her mother went to the store at 7 a.m., and when she returned, the kids were all asleep except for Johnny. Johnny was just missing. She wasn't in her bed. Police began searching for her. 3 days later, she was found 300 yards from her back gate, from the fence line on her back gate at her home. Local men and boys were polygraphed, but no arrests were made. Cops wondered if this murder was related to the women who were missing and dead in the list above. But this murder was not solved that I can tell. I am going to look back into that. That brings us to December 1971, and A phone call from New Mexico was a game changer. Odessa law enforcement had no leads in the disappearance of Gloria Sue Nix Green or in the other cases that I named until a phone call came in from Aztec, New Mexico. The sheriff there wanted a word with Ector County Sheriff A.M. Slim Gabriel. Now, Odessa is in Ector County, if you didn't know that. So, just to clear that up. We've got a prisoner here, says the New Mexico sheriff. He's from your way, over your way, and he's talking. He's telling big tales about murders in Texas, especially in Ector County. We thought you needed to know. Sheriff Cabral knew exactly who the caller was talking about. It was Johnny Meadows. Johnny Meadows was 34 years old, a roughneck who had been working the oil fields around Odessa at the time that Gloria Sue Nix Green went missing 6 months earlier. He was originally from East Texas, Gladewater, but he claimed he'd lived all over and been around in several states. He had been in Odessa for about 3 years before Gloria vanished, and now he had surfaced in Aztec, New Mexico, way up near the Colorado state line, about 600 miles from West Texas, and Sheriff Gabriel. Well, Gabriel had already talked to Meadows once before. That past summer, after, and I keep saying Gloria, but her name is Sue. I mean, she went by Sue. After Sue, the past summer, Meadows had been held in the Ector County Jail on a charge of disposing of mortgaged property. And I'm not even sure what that means, but he was in jail for that. Law enforcement, however, didn't have enough to keep him there, not on that charge, and certainly not on anything relating to Gloria Sue Nix Green or the other women. Still, he had always looked good for being the primary suspect. Meadows was connected to multiple victims. He had worked for the same company as Gloria Sue Nix Green. In other words, the company where she was snatched from in that office. He probably had occasion to go by there, and there was no doubt that the two of them were acquainted. So, in the case of Dorothy Smith, the motel owner murdered in Monahans, which is in Ward County, there was another link. Meadows' wife, Dolores, had worked at that same motel, and Johnny knew Dorothy Smith personally. Sheriff Gabriel wasted no time once he got that call. He flew to Aztec to question Meadows in person. By then, Johnny had been living there since November and was working at the San Juan County Hospital. So let's go back and talk about 1968 and when he came there. He had arrived in Odessa before October 1968, and he had stayed there through mid-November when he left and went to New Mexico. He worked as a roughneck, and like many others, he had come to West Texas for the oil field money. No experience needed to become a roughneck, just the brute strength and the willingness to do hard, dirty work for long hours. The money was good. That's why people came, but it also brought in a wide mix of men. Some of them were looking for a paycheck, just good family men, and then others were drifters and loners and outright criminals. That's where the term oil field trash comes from. I've counted 5 men in my own family who worked in the Texas oil fields, so I'm not saying that people who work in the oil field are trash. I'm just telling you that that's where the term came from. My family, the men in my family would say, you know, the oil field is a great place for a man to get some money saved, get caught up on his bills and so forth, if you didn't mind the grind, but there were rough characters, as they called them, working out there. Now, today, I don't know the wages that oil field workers get paid, but back then, roughnecks made top dollar, sometimes even double time, or maybe even more on holidays. If you survived the job without a serious injury, it could be a real stepping stone for you. As for Johnny Meadows, we don't know if he left the oil field in Texas because that work was too much for him, or because the noose was tightening around his neck and he needed to get out of town before someone started asking questions. Okay, back to December 1971. The sheriff is out in New Mexico talking to Johnny Meadows. The details from this part of the story start to get kind of wobbly, I would call it, because they come from multiple sources and it's just hard to keep up with the exact order everything happened in, but I think I've got it worked out. Based on everything I've read, this is how it unfolded. When Sheriff Gabriel arrived at the San Juan County Jail in New Mexico, he asked Johnny Meadows if he remembered the women and those who had gone missing and those he had found who had been found murdered back in Ector County. Johnny Meadows said yes, he did remember. Sheriff Gabriel kept him talking, and with every passing minute, the sheriff grew more certain this man was the Odessa killer. Meadows just knew too much, too many precise details about each woman's case, and things only a killer could have known. But he didn't give up anything. You know, there was no reason that the sheriff could just jump on it and say, look, you're arrested. Okay, Gabriel did learn while they were talking that Johnny was worried about his family, specifically whether his wife and children had enough money to survive. Now, it could have been that he was a manipulator and a con. So it could have been that he was just trying to manipulate the sheriff to see what he could get out of him. That would not be surprising at all. Now, the truth was that Dolores, Johnny's wife, was desperate because Johnny was in jail. She had 3 littles to feed and take care of, and probably was having trouble, getting a job while you had to have somebody to take care of the little ones. So she was in a bad way as far as money goes. And so the sheriff, knowing this, just kind of made a big decision to call her, and he offered her $2,000 in exchange for helping him get a confession from Johnny. So in 1971, $2,000 had the buying power of, get this, $15,792. That's crazy, but yeah, that's how much you could, whatever you could buy today for that amount of money, $2,000 would take care of that much for you in 1971. Doris was desperate, so she agreed. She called the jail and talked to Johnny. She told him, look, you need to tell the sheriff what he needs to know, what he's wanting to know. And she explained that the authorities had promised, the sheriff had promised, and Ector County had backed him up, that if Johnny would tell the truth, tell them what he knew about Gloria Sue Nix Green, and especially if he would tell the sheriff where her body was, she would get that $2,000. And, it was cold in New Mexico in the winter, up there close to Colorado, and she was having trouble making ends meet. So, amazingly, that got through to Johnny Meadows, and he decided that he would talk if he had assurances the money would actually go to Dolores. And the sheriff had his trust, and so Johnny started talking. First, he said he told them where to look for Gloria Sue Nix Green's body. Back in Ector County, the sheriff's office got a call from Sheriff Gabriel, and he said, go look here, here, and here. And sure enough, they found her skeletal remains, just as Johnny Meadows had said. She was lying under a rotting mattress in a vacant lot in South Odessa. Well, at the time of his confession, Meadows was still being held in the San Juan County Jail, facing charges from 3 different cities, including Gainesville, Texas. He had missed a court appearance there earlier in the year, and that led to his bond being revoked. So Sheriff Gabriel could not file charges on him while he was at the New Mexico jail. So he had to get him back to Ector County to charge him with the crime and then for him, to get that case to the grand jury and so forth. Anyhow, working together with the Gainesville police, San Juan authorities, and Ector County, they coordinated Meadows' return back to Texas. The plan was to get him to Ector County to face those charges, and after that, then he could go to Gainesville to deal with his pending case there and wherever else he needed to go. I think Fort Worth was even one of the places. Okay. We're still in San Juan. There's an open window that's going to be a little problem. Just before they were set to transport Meadows back to Texas, he asked to meet privately with his attorney. They were led into a room together and left alone. Well, Meadows spotted a window left ajar, and without warning, he leapt through it and fled the San Juan County Jail facility. But his freedom didn't last long. He went straight to his nearby residence in Aztec and holed up in an upstairs room. Authorities tracked him there and recaptured him within 2 hours. Sheriff Cabral drove Meadows back to Texas himself. It was a long road trip, plenty of time for conversation, and Johnny liked to talk. The sheriff never said outright what was discussed, but his remarks afterwards suggested that Meadows may have confessed to even more crimes along the way. Back in Ector County, Johnny Meadows was officially charged with Gloria Sue Nix Green's death. Okay, October 1972. So that was December 1971. So we're all the way into the next fall. And Johnny has been in Ector County all this time, or in Texas, taking care of his court appearances. Johnny got really angry in early October, really angry, because his wife, Dolores, he knew was filing for divorce. And I guess for some reason, she did not want to be married to a man the press had dubbed the Odessa Lust Killer. Well, Meadows' rage boiled over about Dolores, and in a fit of spite, he told the sheriff that Dolores had been his accomplice in the murders of Linda Cugat and Ruth Maynard. Authorities in New Mexico picked her up, and she was in their jail fighting extradition back to Texas. Well, in a few days, Meadows cooled off, and reality must have hit him that now he had caused his children not to have any parents. So he recanted, and he admitted he lied about Dolores's involvement. She had known nothing about the crimes. The charges against her were dropped, and she was released from jail. I don't get it. Why were they even listening to a thing he said? Because, and this is something I've struggled with trying to understand, and you'll see why. He had tried to escape. He had changed his story repeatedly, and now he was accusing his own wife just to hurt her of being an accomplice to those murders. So I don't know why you would call him a credible source, but anyhow, enough to arrest a woman on. So now we're going to talk about the 1972 Furman ruling, and you're going, what? But I'll explain. While still in custody in New Mexico, Meadows pled guilty to the murder of Gloria Sue Nix Green. The fact that he knew where her body was helped seal the deal. He was sentenced to 99 years or life. Then on October 13th, 1972, Meadows called a press conference. Yeah, he called a press conference. Okay, alongside the Ector County Sheriff's Department employees, the deputies, I guess you'd say, he announced that he had signed confessions in the murder of Miss Green, along with the murders of Linda Cugat, Dorothy Smith, and Ruth Maynard. Anyway, he said, this is what he said: I had a chance to save my own life and I took it, he told the Odessa American. And what he meant was this. In 1972, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down the Furman versus Georgia decision, which led Texas and other states to halt the death penalty. The state began reevaluating its laws, and for a time, capital punishment was off the table. If Meadows pled guilty right then to all of the other murders during that legal limbo, he could avoid the death penalty and receive a life sentence instead. That was a smart move. If he had waited to go to trial, the laws could have changed again, and the state might have brought the death penalty back onto the table. He was a conflicted man. He said himself, I lived several lives, and that suggests that he had a fractured mind, or he knew he had mental problems. At least, he had motivations that warred against each other. He said he was ashamed of that, what he'd done, and he wouldn't speak in detail about the crimes and what he had done. Unlike today, because they really pressure uh, killers to explain everything to them. But he did not, and they didn't press him for anything further. When they asked if he was involved in other unsolved murders in the area, he would not confirm that, and he didn't deny it either. Now, for context, District Attorney John Green suggested Meadows could be linked to as many as 8 murders, and as I wrapped up this article, I found more information, and I think that it's possible he was even linked to 15 murders before it was all over with. And just when law enforcement and the public started to breathe a sigh of relief, thinking, that this was over and they could move on pretty quick, Meadows recanted and said he wasn't guilty after all. So Ector County prosecutors began preparing to take him to trial for the murders of Linda Cugat and Ruth Maynard. And so that was in October 1972. Fast forward to December 1972. Meadows received permission to keep a tape recorder in his cell for personal use. A couple of weeks later, he tried to smuggle out taped recordings he had made in his cell so they could be taken to a local news station. Somehow, he managed to get the tapes into the lining of a female prisoner's winter jacket who had an appointment in court. She was patted down when she was leaving to go before the judge. After those tapes were found and confiscated, Meadows was moved and put into an isolated cell, while his old cell was tossed and emptied out to see what else he was hiding. The sheriff's men hit pay dirt, along with the tape recorder and an old pair of slippers Meadows wore when confined to his cell. They found a realistic carved replica of a .32 automatic pistol made from fused bars of Lifebuoy soap. They also found a dark liquid-like substance in the bottom of a disposable cup, which he must have intended to use to darken the soap gun. When they confiscated the soap gun, reports say it was still the color of soap. So now we're into 1973, and he pulled another one. At the beginning of this story, I told you I could only remember the phrase branded initials, but I remembered why, but I just oh, yeah, maybe if I put those 2 words together, that will help me find the killer, and then I can find the women. So here's the part of the story where that comes from. In February 1973, while in the Ector County Jail waiting for his trial to begin for the murders of Linda Cugat and Ruth Maynard, the court had held hearings to determine if the October 13th, 1972 confessions regarding Cugat and Maynard's murders were voluntary. That is when Johnny Meadows, this is so funny, it's ridiculous, accused Ector County's employees of a bad crime. He said a fellow there named Tom Barker and the sheriff's deputies branded him with the initials of the women he had allegedly killed, and that his confessions were not voluntary. He was forced with a branding iron. Well, when officials looked into it, they had Meadows remove his shirt in court for them. And sure enough, on his back were branded initials C, Cugat, G, Green, M, Maynard, and S for Smith. Shockingly, his back also displayed the scarred flesh from 4 Texas-shaped brands. Well, the local district judge, who would have been the presiding boss judge of the county, his name was John Vance, Judge John Vance. He ruled that any of Meadows's confessions should be thrown out, and the claims that he had made against the people and the workers there in law enforcement and the district attorney's office should be investigated. The district attorney's office, the sheriff's office, the jail, all needed to be thoroughly gone over and find out why this bad behavior had shown up. Well, I believe it's kind of hard. There was no, it wasn't definite on who was that, which agency was taking over that investigation, but it seemed like just that ultimately it was the Texas Attorney General's responsibility to determine the findings, and I believe that the Texas Rangers and the FBI did the investigation. So Johnny Meadows' court-appointed lawyer, Tom Sneed, said it would have been impossible for him to brand himself, because where it was on his back. The lawyer and Meadows pointed the finger at Tom Barker, who was the investigator for Ector County's district attorney. Okay. So Tom Barker scoffed at that. He's like, that's ridiculous. And it was. And he said that, he had nothing to do with it. But the brandings on his back convinced the judge that Tom Barker must have done it by having deputies hold him down, just like Meadows had said. Well, finally, in May of that year, another judge reversed the ruling because of what the Texas Attorney General's office came back with. Ranger agents, Texas Rangers, went and spoke with cellmates of Meadows while he had stayed in the Dallas County jail cleaning up his problems or whatever. The Ranger agents questioned his cellmates from that stay at the Dallas County jail. The inmates told the Rangers who were investigating that Johnny Meadows had used pilfered coat hangers, more than one. I mean, how did they even get a hold of coat hangers? And just let me tell you, coat hangers back in the day were still, I mean, it was a good bit of metal, so it wasn't like just really easily broken metal. And they were thicker too. Like, you didn't want to get a spanking with a coat hanger or even get swatted at, because that was a tool. Anyhow, they had created branding irons out of coat hangers, and he had received the brands on his back with the help of cellmates who shared his space during that time. The whole thing was such an expensive hoax because it held up court proceedings, caused delays, caused lawyers to bill more hours they didn't need, and they didn't get paid for some of that in the end. Anyhow, his court-appointed attorney or attorneys did not get paid for that, and it just generally took up the state's and the court's time. I mean, even the Attorney General's office had to get involved in that. Why? Again, why are they even listening to this cookie? So here's the aftermath. In 1973, the charges were dropped for Linda Cugat and Ruth Maynard because a lifetime sentence was imposed on Meadows for Gloria Sue Nix Green. Authorities thought it was enough to keep him in prison, and it was for a while. But I just want to say today, there is not going to, I mean, I think if a guy is as bad as Johnny Meadows is, that district attorney's office is going to go ahead and stack those sentences up, go ahead and try him and stack them up so that just in case some kind of fluke would spring him from jail, he would still be in there if he had another one that he had to serve for. So it did keep him in jail for a while. The crimes of Johnny Meadows were deemed for history and by the press and law enforcement they will be forever known as the Odessa Lust killings. He was said to be overcome with lust when seeing these women, which caused him to overpower them, abduct, rape, and kill them. His legacy? Johnny Meadows was a worthless predator whose only life action of value was to confess to Gloria Green's murder and where her body was so that Dolores Meadows could receive $2,000 from Sheriff Gabriel and feed and clothe her children that winter. The sheriff's bribery of the wife might have been thought of as questionable, but if you were doing police work in 1971 without DNA or security cameras, this type of bribery might be your only hope to get a horrible monster off the street. But be clear that in 1971, there were no laws against what the sheriff did. Some in law enforcement did not think Dorothy Smith or Eula Miller were the work of Meadows because he had strangled the other four women and their bodies and they were shot. However, I did not find any further comment on Nancy Mitchell, who was mentioned in the list at the beginning of the story, but I do plan to go in and dig in around her and see what happened there. But I don't think her body was ever found. To kind of wrap this up, I'll just tell you where a couple of things that I learned at the end of research, and that is he was born, I went to ancestry.com, and that's where I get a lot of my information, but I, tracked him through on a little family tree, found out he was born August 30th, 1936 in Gladewater, Gregg County. He entered the Texas prison system as a convicted murderer in 1973, and he died while he was incarcerated at age 63 in Polk County. Currently, the only state prison I find in Polk County is the Allen Polunsky unit in Livingston, Texas. There may have been others there in 2000 when he died. He may have been in a different unit, but Polunsky is, I know that's one, at least that may be the main place they keep death penalty prisoners. That he was buried in the Captain Joe Bird Cemetery at Huntsville, Walker County, Texas. And sure enough, I checked findagrave.com and found his grave and death recorded there too. I do want to tell you one more thing, and that is in 1990, Johnny Meadows was, let's see, 1990. Okay, he went in, about 1973. 1970, in 1983, he was up for parole, and Sheriff Gabriel went to the hearing, and he said, if you let this man out of prison, he's going to kill somebody within 2 days. He has to kill women. And so he did not get parole. 10 years later, 7 years later in 1990, I don't know why Gabriel wasn't there, but apparently he missed that hearing and didn't send in a letter, and they let Johnny Meadows out. So I did not know this until yesterday, and my next story is going to be what happened after 1990. I appreciate you watching this video and for following me, and I hope you have found this story interesting about Johnny Meadows and Odessa's serial killer and the rough time that was going on in West Texas oil fields for women who were alone at any point. Okay, thank you so much again for listening, and I appreciate y'all. And I'll be back in another week or 10 days with a new story. Thanks.